When we think about strategic bombing during the Second World War, our minds often conjure images carefully crafted by cinema, those dramatic sequences where aircraft glide through pristine skies in perfect formation, releasing their payloads with almost surgical precision, and below, controlled detonations bloom like carefully choreographed fireworks. But this sanitized version bears almost no resemblance to what actually transpired over German cities in those final desperate years of the conflict. What happened in the skies over Europe was something altogether different, something far more chaotic, far more overwhelming, and infinitely more terrifying than any Hollywood production has ever dared to portray. The reality of the Allied bombing campaign wasn't about precision strikes or carefully targeted raids. It was about something much more fundamental and brutal, an application of industrial warfare on a scale that defied comprehension. The bombers that flew over Germany didn't simply damage their targets, they systematically erased entire urban landscapes, transforming thriving cities into wastelands within the span of a single night. This wasn't achieved through any kind of surgical accuracy or technological wizardry. Instead, it was the result of raw, overwhelming force, the product of careful mathematical calculations combined with an understanding of how fire behaves when given unlimited fuel, and the willingness to deploy resources on a scale that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier. Consider how this campaign evolved over time. When the war began in 1939, bombing raids were relatively modest affairs. You might see a few dozen aircraft taking to the skies, perhaps dropping several hundred bombs on their intended targets. The planes themselves were smaller, carried lighter payloads, and the entire enterprise operated on what we might now consider a human scale. Individual crews could still conceive of what their missions meant in concrete terms. They could visualize the targets, understand the objectives, and comprehend the scope of what they were attempting to accomplish. But as the war ground on, as the conflict consumed more resources, more lives, more of everything, the nature of aerial bombardment underwent a transformation so profound that it became something entirely new. By the time 1943 rolled around, the bombing campaign had metamorphosed into something apocalyptic. The British Bomber Command, operating primarily under cover of darkness, and the American 8th Air Force, conducting their operations in daylight, had developed the capacity to launch raids involving more than 1,000 heavy bombers in a single operation. Let that number sink in for a moment. 1,000 aircraft, each one a massive 4-engine behemoth, each one crewed by highly trained specialists, each one capable of carrying multiple tons of ordnance. When these formations took to the sky, they represented an industrial effort of staggering proportions, the culmination of thousands of hours of training, millions of dollars worth of equipment, and a logistical apparatus that stretched across continents. Each of these bombers didn't just carry one type of explosive. The bomb loads were carefully calculated combinations designed to maximize destruction through a kind of deadly synergy. High explosive bombs, weighing hundreds or even thousands of pounds each, would fall first, their purpose clear and terrible. When they detonated, they didn't just create craters. They shattered buildings, tore apart infrastructure, exposed the interiors of structures, and ripped away protective elements like roofs, walls, and doors. They created the conditions for what would come next. Following these initial blasts came the incendiaries, smaller bombs designed not to explode with massive force, but to ignite everything they touched. These fire-starting devices would tumble into the wreckage created by the high explosives, into the now exposed interiors of buildings, into the debris-strewn streets, and there they would begin their work. The stated objective of these raids extended far beyond simply destroying individual factories or military installations. The planners behind these operations had conceived of something far more ambitious and far more ruthless. They aimed to eliminate entire cities as functioning entities, to remove them from the economic equation of the war entirely. This meant targeting not just industrial facilities, but the housing where workers lived, the infrastructure that supported daily life, the civic buildings that enabled urban organization, everything that made a city capable of contributing to the German war effort. Some have characterized this strategy as area bombing, others have used more euphemistic terms, but the fundamental reality was straightforward enough. The goal was urban annihilation on a comprehensive scale. To understand what this meant in practice, we need to examine specific instances where this strategy was applied with full force. Hamburg provides perhaps the most chilling example, a case study in what happens when modern industrial warfare confronts a densely populated urban environment. In July of 1943, the Allies launched Operation Gomorrah, a name borrowed from biblical accounts of divine destruction, and the choice of nomenclature proved grimly appropriate. Over the course of 8 days, a succession of raids delivered approximately 9,000 tons of bombs onto the city. 9,000 tons. To put this in perspective, that represents £18 million of explosive materials and incendiary devices rained down upon a single metropolitan area in just over a week. But the raw tonnage, as staggering as it might be, doesn't fully capture what occurred. The bombs themselves were merely the catalyst for something far worse. The combination of high explosives and incendiaries, deployed in those specific ratios, under particular weather conditions, with that concentration of targets, created a phenomenon that even the planners hadn't fully anticipated. Thousands upon thousands of individual fires, ignited by the incendiary bombs, began to merge and combine. Each small fire fed on whatever combustible material it could find, spreading outward, growing stronger. And as these fires encountered each other, as they joined together, they created larger conflagrations. These larger fires drew in more air to feed their appetite for oxygen, and this created winds, powerful drafts of air rushing toward the flames. This process didn't stop at some moderate equilibrium. Instead, under the right conditions, it escalated into something called a firestorm, a meteorological phenomenon created entirely by human action. In a firestorm, the individual blazes completely merge into a single, unified conflagration that generates its own weather system. The flames become so intense, consume so much oxygen, generate so much heat, that they create powerful updrafts. Cool air from the surrounding areas rushes in to replace the rising superheated gases, and these winds can reach extraordinary velocities. During the Hamburg firestorm, observers recorded wind speeds exceeding 150 miles per hour, hurricane-force winds created purely by the fire's own heat. The temperatures achieved in the heart of this inferno exceeded anything most people could imagine outside of an industrial furnace. The fires reached approximately 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt glass, to warp steel, to ignite materials that under normal circumstances wouldn't burn at all. Asphalt in the streets didn't just soften, it liquefied, becoming a bubbling, tar-like substance that trapped anyone unfortunate enough to step into it. Water in canals and basins began to boil, metal structures warped and collapsed. The very air itself became lethal, superheated to the point where breathing it would sear lung tissue. Entire neighborhoods simply ceased to exist. The fires consumed everything combustible, and the heat damaged or destroyed what remained. In the aftermath, rescue workers and surveyors found areas where city blocks had been reduced to ash and rubble so thoroughly that it became difficult to determine where streets had been, where buildings had stood, how the district had been organized before the raid. The firestorm had created a kind of artificial volcanic landscape, a hellscape of smouldering ruins and twisted metal. The human cost defied easy comprehension. In that single week, approximately 42,000 people lost their lives in Hamburg. 42,000 individual deaths, each one representing someone's final moments in that inferno. The survivors who eventually shared their accounts described scenes that seemed to belong more to nightmare than reality. People who had taken shelter in buildings, who thought they might wait out the raid in relative safety, found themselves trapped as fires surrounded their refuges. Those who attempted to flee into the streets to escape the flames often found themselves facing an impossible choice: remain inside and die from heat and smoke, or venture outside and face the firestorm directly. Those who did try to escape through the streets during the height of the firestorm reported something almost beyond belief. They described watching people spontaneously burst into flames simply from exposure to the superheated air without any direct contact with fire. The temperature had risen to such extremes that the very atmosphere became incendiary. Human bodies, with their water content and organic matter, would begin to combust when exposed to such conditions. Witnesses reported seeing individuals running, desperately seeking safety, only to suddenly ignite, their clothing and hair catching fire first, then the body itself, transforming a living person into a human torch in seconds. The shelters that were supposed to provide protection often became tombs. As the firestorm raged above, consuming oxygen at a prodigious rate, the air pressure dropped dramatically. The storm pulled air from wherever it could find it, including from cellars, basements, and underground shelters where civilians had gathered. People packed into these supposedly safe spaces found the oxygen being literally sucked out of their refuge. They suffocated not from smoke inhalation, though that claimed many lives as well, but from simple lack of breathable air. Rescue workers who entered some of these shelters days later found hundreds of bodies showing no signs of burns or physical trauma. They had simply asphyxiated as the firestorm drained the oxygen from their sanctuary. Hamburg wasn't an isolated incident or an unfortunate accident. It was a demonstration of capabilities, a proof of concept that would be applied repeatedly as the war continued. The lessons learned from creating that firestorm, the understanding of how to combine high explosives with incendiaries to maximize destruction, the knowledge of which weather conditions and urban layouts made cities most vulnerable to this type of attack, all of this was catalogued, studied, and refined for future operations. Dresden, in February of 1945, became another name synonymous with the catastrophic power of strategic bombing. The circumstances surrounding Dresden were particularly tragic because by that point in the war, the city had swelled far beyond its normal population. Refugees fleeing the advancing Soviet armies from the east had poured into the city, believing it to be relatively safe, that its cultural significance and lack of major military industry might spare it from the worst of the bombing campaign. The city's population, normally around 600,000, had potentially doubled with these desperate refugees, families who had abandoned their homes in the east, carrying what few possessions they could manage, seeking any kind of safety. Over 2 days in mid-February, approximately 1,200 bombers delivered their payloads onto Dresden. The total tonnage dropped on the city reached about 3,900 tons, nearly 4,000 tons of explosives and incendiaries concentrated on a relatively compact urban area. The raid was conducted in waves, with the British attacking at night and the Americans following up during daylight hours. This sequential approach had its own cruel logic. The initial nighttime raid would destroy buildings, create rubble, and ignite fires. Then, as rescue workers and fire brigades attempted to respond, as civilians emerged from shelters to assess the damage and begin recovery efforts, the daytime raids would strike, targeting the survivors and those attempting to render aid. Dresden experienced its own firestorm, perhaps not quite as intense as Hamburg's, but devastating nonetheless. The flames swept through the Baroque architecture, the cultural landmarks, the residential districts, and the areas where refugees had gathered. The death toll remains disputed to this day, with estimates ranging from about 25,000 to potentially higher numbers, though modern scholarship has generally settled on figures at the lower end of that range. Regardless of the exact number, the scale of death in such a short time frame was immense. The firestorm consumed the city centre so completely that whole blocks essentially vanished. Structures that had stood for centuries were reduced to ash in hours. Survivors left accounts that haunt anyone who reads them. One individual wrote a description that captured the essential horror of the firestorm in simple, direct language. They didn't say the fire burned you, they said it swallowed you. This distinction is crucial. A conventional fire might burn someone who comes into contact with it, causing injuries of varying severity depending on exposure. But a firestorm of this magnitude didn't wait for contact. It engulfed everything in its path, overwhelming all resistance, consuming oxygen, radiating heat so intense that escape became impossible. People didn't just burn, they were incinerated, vaporized in some cases, reduced to ash so completely that identification became impossible. The mathematical scope of the entire bombing campaign against Germany beggars belief when you examine the cumulative totals. By the time the war ended in May 1945, Allied air forces had dropped approximately 1.4 million tons of bombs on German territory. 1.4 million tons translates to 2.8 billion pounds of explosives and incendiaries. Consider what that means in practical terms. If you attempted to visualize 2.8 billion pounds of anything, the human mind struggles to create a meaningful mental image. Stack that weight in bombs of various sizes, from small incendiaries to massive blockbusters weighing several tons each, and you begin to appreciate the industrial scale of destruction that was delivered from the air. This concentrated bombardment didn't spread evenly across Germany. Certain cities bore the brunt of repeated attacks. Cologne, the ancient cathedral city on the Rhine, endured the dubious distinction of being struck by bombing raids 262 times during the course of the war. 262 separate attacks on a single city. Essen, heart of the Ruhr industrial region, faced relentless assault as bombers targeted the foundries, the coal mines, the steel mills that fed Germany's war machine. Berlin, the capital, massive and sprawling, absorbed countless raids, with different districts targeted in succession, as the Allies worked systematically to dismantle the city's ability to function. The physical destruction was comprehensive. Cities like Cologne lost more than half of their total building stock. In some areas, the destruction was even more complete. Industrial districts might see 70, 80, even 90% of structures damaged or destroyed. Residential areas faced similar devastation. The Germany that existed in 1945 bore little physical resemblance to the Germany of 1939. Entire urban landscapes had been rewritten, with vast stretches of rubble replacing what had once been functioning neighborhoods. The human cost extended far beyond the death toll, though that alone was staggering. Estimates suggest that over 500,000 German civilians died as a direct result of the bombing campaign. 500,000 individual deaths, each one representing a unique person with their own story, their own family, their own life cut short by high explosives or fire or suffocation in a shelter. Beyond those who died, millions found themselves homeless. Their houses had been destroyed, their possessions lost, their neighborhoods transformed into uninhabitable wastelands. These displaced populations strained the resources of areas that had been spared the worst of the bombing, creating humanitarian crises that compounded the general collapse of German civil society. The economic impact of this destruction went beyond merely damaging factories. German industry collapsed not because individual facilities had been destroyed, though many had, but because the entire support system that enabled industrial production ceased to function. Consider what a factory needs to operate. It needs workers, and those workers need housing within reasonable distance of the plant. It needs transportation infrastructure to bring in raw materials and ship out finished products. It needs electrical power, water, communications. It needs a functioning civil society around it, with shops to feed the workers, schools for their children, hospitals to treat the injured and sick. The bombing campaign systematically dismantled all of these supporting elements. When you destroy a city's housing stock, the workers who operated the factories have nowhere to live. They either flee to other areas or die in the raids. When you destroy the transportation infrastructure, cutting rail lines, demolishing bridges, cratering roads, raw materials cannot reach the factories, and finished products cannot be distributed. When you hit electrical generation facilities and water treatment plants, even undamaged factories cannot operate. The genius, if we can use such a word for something so destructive, of the area bombing campaign was that it created cascading failures throughout the German economy. The American daylight precision bombing campaign, often contrasted with the British night area bombing, added another dimension to this systematic destruction. The Americans, flying their heavily armed B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, specialized in attempting to hit specific high-value targets with greater accuracy than was possible during nighttime raids. They identified choke points in the German war economy, places where the destruction of a single type of facility would have disproportionate effects on Germany's ability to continue fighting. Ball bearings represented one such choke point. These seemingly simple mechanical components, precision-manufactured steel balls that reduced friction in rotating machinery, were absolutely essential to modern mechanical systems. Every vehicle, every aircraft, every piece of industrial equipment relied on ball bearings. Without them, axles seized up, engines failed, machinery ground to a halt. Germany produced most of its ball bearings in a concentrated set of factories around the town of Schweinfurt. American planners recognized that destroying these facilities would have cascading effects throughout the German military-industrial complex. Schweinfurt faced repeated attacks, each one aimed at the ball-bearing plants with as much precision as the technology of the era allowed. The raids were costly for the Americans. Flying in daylight meant facing the full strength of German air defenses, both fighters and anti-aircraft artillery. The losses were substantial, but the attacks continued because the strategic value was deemed worth the cost. Without adequate ball-bearing production, German tank factories couldn't maintain output. Aircraft assembly slowed. New submarines couldn't be completed on schedule. The entire machinery of war began to grind more slowly, starved of these crucial components. Synthetic fuel plants represented another critical vulnerability. Germany lacked natural oil reserves and had invested heavily in chemical processes to create synthetic petroleum products from coal, which it possessed in abundance. These synthetic fuel facilities, massive industrial complexes requiring enormous capital investment and technical expertise to construct, became prime targets for American bombers. The plants at Leuna, Pölitz, and other locations faced systematic attack throughout 1944 and into 1945. The impact of destroying these fuel production facilities rippled through the German military with devastating effect. By late 1944, Germany was producing only a fraction of the fuel required to maintain military operations at the levels seen earlier in the war. Panzer divisions found themselves immobilized not because they lacked tanks, but because those tanks had no fuel for their engines. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of European skies, discovered that it possessed hundreds of aircraft that couldn't fly because there was no aviation fuel available. Pilots underwent months of expensive training, learning the intricacies of flying high-performance fighters, only to find themselves assigned to units that couldn't conduct operations because the fuel tanks were empty. This fuel shortage created a vicious cycle that the Germans couldn't break. Without fuel for fighters, the Luftwaffe couldn't effectively defend against bomber raids. Without fighter protection, the bombers could strike targets with increasing impunity. As the bombers struck more targets, including more synthetic fuel plants, the fuel shortage worsened, further reducing the Luftwaffe's ability to respond. The Germans found themselves trapped in a downward spiral from which there was no escape. The psychological impact of the bombing campaign operated on a different level, but was no less significant than the physical destruction. The constant threat of air raids fundamentally altered the daily experience of life in German cities. The wail of air raid sirens became a regular feature of existence, sometimes multiple times per day. When the sirens sounded, civilians had minutes at most to seek shelter before the bombers arrived overhead. This meant that daily activities were constantly interrupted, that sleep was frequently disrupted, that the simple act of living required constant vigilance and readiness to flee to shelter at any moment. Children growing up in German cities during the bombing campaign experienced a childhood fundamentally different from what would be considered normal. Their early memories were formed in air raid shelters, in basements and cellars where families huddled together while explosions thundered overhead. Many young children knew no other reality than this. They couldn't remember a time when air raids weren't a regular occurrence. Schools conducted lessons in shelters when raids seemed imminent. Families slept in basement rooms rather than upstairs bedrooms because being closer to ground level offered slightly better survival odds. An entire generation came of age with the psychological scars of living under constant aerial assault. Civilians attempted to adapt to this new reality in whatever ways they could. People carried buckets filled with sand as they went about their daily business, primitive tools meant to fight incendiary bombs that landed on or near their homes. The idea was that if a small incendiary device landed nearby, you could dump sand on it to smother the fire before it spread. In practice, when thousands of incendiaries fell simultaneously, when high explosive bombs were shattering buildings all around, when firestorms were beginning to form, a bucket of sand was worse than useless. But it represented an attempt to maintain some illusion of control, some sense that individual action could make a difference in the face of overwhelming destruction. Cities developed a strange rhythm to their existence. During daylight hours, people emerged to assess damage, to clear rubble, to attempt repairs, to search for food and water, to maintain whatever semblance of normal life was still possible. As evening approached, as darkness fell, the population retreated to shelters, knowing that British bombers preferred to operate under cover of night. The darkness that had once meant rest and recuperation now meant danger and death. Cities went dark not just from blackout regulations, but because vast areas lacked electrical power, their infrastructure destroyed by previous raids. Entire districts became ghost towns after sunset, emptied of living inhabitants, the streets patrolled only by firefighters, civil defense workers, and those unlucky enough to have duties that kept them above ground. Morning would reveal the night's toll. Rescue workers would emerge to find new sections of the city reduced to rubble, new fires that needed to be extinguished, new casualties that needed to be recovered. The cycle would repeat day after day, week after week, month after month, with no end in sight until the war itself concluded. Albert Speer, who served as Germany's Minister of Armaments and War Production, was in a unique position to assess the impact of the bombing campaign on Germany's ability to continue fighting. After the war, when he was interviewed extensively about his experiences and the inner workings of the German war economy, he made a remarkable admission. He stated that the bombing campaign represented the greatest lost battle of the conflict. This acknowledgement from someone who had worked tirelessly to maintain German war production, who had access to all the economic data and industrial reports, who understood better than almost anyone else the material situation of the Third Reich, carries tremendous weight. Speer was acknowledging that despite all the resources Germany had invested in defensive measures, despite the construction of massive flak towers, despite the deployment of thousands of anti-aircraft guns, despite maintaining a fighter force dedicated to intercepting bombers, despite building underground factories and dispersing production facilities, despite every effort to mitigate or counter the bombing campaign, Germany had ultimately failed to prevent the systematic destruction of its cities and industrial capacity from the air. The irony of Germany's situation becomes even more apparent when we consider the resources the nation had devoted to developing powerful offensive weapons. Germany had produced some of the most formidable tanks ever designed, like the Tiger and Panther, machines that could devastate opposing armoured forces in direct combat. The Kriegsmarine had constructed massive battleships like the Bismarck and Tirpitz, floating fortresses carrying enormous guns. German engineers had developed revolutionary weapons like the V-2 rocket, a technological marvel that represented the birth of modern rocketry. Yet none of these impressive weapon systems could do anything to stop the bombers overhead. Tanks, no matter how well armoured or how powerful their guns, couldn't shoot down aircraft flying at 20,000 feet. Battleships, trapped in port by Allied naval supremacy and air power, served little purpose beyond tying up resources that might have been better used elsewhere. The V-2 rockets, while terrifying to the civilian populations they struck, had no meaningful impact on the war's outcome and consumed resources that Germany desperately needed for more practical defensive measures. All of these expensive, sophisticated weapons represented massive investments of materials, labour, and technical expertise, yet they were essentially irrelevant to the greatest threat Germany faced, the rain of bombs from above. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, the service that had pioneered close air support and had terrorized cities across Europe with its own bombing campaigns, found itself systematically destroyed by a combination of factors. The losses suffered on the Eastern Front, where the Luftwaffe had fought a grinding war of attrition against Soviet air power, had bled the force of experienced pilots and aircraft. The fuel shortages resulting from the attacks on synthetic fuel plants meant that even when aircraft were available, they often couldn't fly. Pilot training programs had to be shortened and simplified because there wasn't enough fuel for adequate instruction. This meant that new pilots arrived at operational units with far less experience than their predecessors, making them easy prey for veteran Allied pilots. By 1944, the disparity had grown so extreme that formations of 1,000 Allied bombers could penetrate deep into German airspace with only sporadic interference from German fighters. The bomber streams, stretching for miles across the sky, represented an aerial armada of almost incomprehensible size. Each aircraft in these formations was a complex machine requiring precise maintenance, a trained crew, a steady supply of fuel and ammunition, and careful coordination with hundreds of other aircraft. The fact that the Allies could regularly launch operations of this scale demonstrated an industrial and logistical capacity that Germany simply could not match. The anti-aircraft defences that Germany had constructed represented a massive investment of resources. Thousands of heavy flak guns ringed German cities and key facilities. These weapons, typically 88mm or larger, would fire shells that would explode at predetermined altitudes, creating deadly clouds of shrapnel that could tear through aircraft. During a major raid, the sky would fill with the black puffs of exploding flak shells, so dense that it sometimes seemed impossible that any aircraft could fly through it unscathed. The noise was tremendous, a continuous thundering roar as hundreds or thousands of guns fired as rapidly as their crews could load and aim them. Yet for all their impressive display, the flak guns faced fundamental limitations. They were shooting at targets moving at high speeds at high altitudes, trying to predict where an aircraft would be when the shell reached the proper altitude and exploded. This required complex calculations, accounting for aircraft speed, altitude, heading, wind conditions, and the time of flight for the shell. Even the most advanced fire control systems of the era could only achieve so much accuracy. Most shells exploded harmlessly, their shrapnel finding only empty air. The sheer volume of fire meant that some bombers would inevitably be hit, some crews would die, some aircraft would be damaged or destroyed. But the mathematics of the situation favoured the attackers. The Allies could afford losses that would have been unsustainable for Germany. American industrial capacity alone was producing bombers at a rate that more than replaced losses. The massive bomber factories in the United States were turning out B-17 and B-24s by the thousands. Crew training programs were graduating new airmen at rates that could replace casualties. The fundamental arithmetic of the air war worked in the Allies' favour. They could lose 100 bombers in a raid and launch another raid of equal size within days. Germany, conversely, found it increasingly difficult to replace lost fighters or train new pilots to an adequate standard. One American general captured this dynamic with brutal simplicity when he explained the strategic approach. He noted that the Allies had fought the German army using artillery, and they had fought German cities using bombers. Both campaigns, he explained, had been won through mathematics. This wasn't a particularly poetic or inspiring way to frame the conflict, but it was accurate. Victory in modern industrial warfare came down to logistics, production capacity, and the ability to concentrate overwhelming force at the decisive point. The Allies could produce more shells, more bombs, more aircraft, more of everything than Germany could, and they could deliver those materials in devastating quantities. The Hollywood version of these events, when it addresses the bombing campaign at all, tends to focus on individual stories, on the crews of specific bombers, on tales of heroism and sacrifice among the airmen. These stories have their place and their value. The men who flew these missions faced genuine dangers, and many of them died in service to their countries. But this focus on individual narratives and clean dramatic visuals misses the fundamental nature of what the bombing campaign actually was. A film might show one bomber dropping its payload, might focus on a single explosion or a limited area of destruction, because that's what works dramatically and what can be reasonably depicted with the budgets and technologies available to filmmakers. A single neat explosion, carefully choreographed and filmed, creates visual impact and moves the story forward without overwhelming the audience. But this sanitized version bears no resemblance to the reality of what happened in Hamburg or Dresden or Cologne or dozens of other cities. The reality was square miles of urban landscape burning simultaneously. It was fires so intense and so widespread that they merged into single conflagrations that created their own weather patterns. It was asphalt in streets melting into tarry liquids, glass running like water, steel girders softening and collapsing under heat that exceeded the operating temperatures of industrial furnaces. It was people dying not primarily from the direct blast effects of bombs, though many certainly did, but from suffocation, from the firestorm sucking the oxygen out of their lungs, from smoke inhalation, from being trapped in burning buildings with no escape, from being caught in the open when the superheated air ignited their clothing and bodies. By the time May of 1945 arrived and Germany surrendered unconditionally to the Allies, the physical landscape of the nation had been fundamentally altered. Cologne, with its magnificent Gothic cathedral somehow still standing amid the ruins, had been subjected to those 262 separate bombing raids. The city that existed in May 1945 was a hollow shell of its pre-war self, with vast areas reduced to rubble and only a fraction of its buildings intact and habitable. Berlin, massive and sprawling, had been transformed into a landscape of ruins. The centre of Nazi power, the capital from which Hitler had launched his wars of conquest, had been systematically pounded into submission from the air even before Soviet forces fought their way into the city in the ground battle that marked the war's end. Dresden, controversial to this day because of debates over whether its destruction was militarily necessary so late in the conflict, literally glowed red when viewed from the air for days after the raid. The firestorm had been so intense, had burned so hot and so completely, that infrared radiation from the still smouldering ruins was visible from aircraft flying overhead even days after the attack. The city had been transformed into a vast crematorium, burning with a heat that took an extended time to fully dissipate. The Wehrmacht, the German armed forces, continued fighting with remarkable tenacity, even as their nation collapsed around them. German soldiers, whether motivated by discipline, by fear of Soviet vengeance, by fanatical belief in Nazi ideology, by simple patriotism, or by the harsh punishment meted out to those accused of defeatism, kept manning their positions, kept firing their weapons, kept attempting to slow the Allied advances from both east and west. But these soldiers were attempting to fight a modern war without the industrial support system that such warfare required. Their factories had been destroyed or severely damaged, reducing the flow of replacement weapons, ammunition, and equipment to a trickle. The fuel to power their tanks and trucks, to fly their aircraft, to simply move forces from one threatened sector to another, was increasingly unavailable as synthetic fuel production collapsed under the weight of repeated bombing. The homes where their families lived, the cities they were ostensibly defending, many of these had ceased to exist as functioning urban entities. A soldier fighting at the front might receive letters telling him that his hometown had been destroyed, that his family was dead or displaced, that everything he had known before the war was gone. The bombers had achieved this. They had not defeated the German army on the battlefield directly. That was accomplished by the grinding campaigns in Russia, by the breakout from Normandy, by the advance across France, by the final push into Germany itself. But the bombers had destroyed the foundation upon which that army rested. They had eliminated the factories that produced weapons. They had destroyed the plants that refined fuel. They had killed and displaced the workers who operated the industrial machinery. They had shattered the transportation networks that moved goods and materials. They had broken the civil society that supported military operations. The conclusion we must draw from examining this campaign is harsh and uncomfortable. In the context of mid-20th century industrial warfare, concentrated aerial bombardment could achieve the near-total destruction of an urban area in a remarkably short time period. The technology of the era, heavy bombers capable of carrying multi-ton payloads over long distances, combined with the right tactics, the mixture of high explosives and incendiaries, could reduce a thriving city to a burning waste ground in a single night. No defensive measures available to 1940s technology could reliably prevent this. No amount of concrete shelters, anti-aircraft guns, fighter aircraft, or civil defense preparations could guarantee safety against an attack of sufficient scale and intensity. The human will to resist, which military leaders often invoke as a decisive factor in warfare, proved largely irrelevant when confronted with destruction on this scale. People can endure tremendous hardships, can survive under conditions that seem impossible, can maintain morale and determination through incredible trials. But there are limits to what can be endured. When a firestorm is consuming your city, when temperatures are reaching 1500 degrees, when the air itself is being sucked away, when there is no escape and no hope of rescue, will and determination become meaningless. The physical reality of industrial-scale destruction overrides everything else. Germany didn't collapse solely because of military defeats on the battlefields, though those defeats were certainly decisive. The nation collapsed under multiple converging pressures, one of the most significant being the systematic destruction visited upon it from the air. The bombing campaign didn't win the war by itself. Wars are never that simple, but it was an essential component of Allied victory. It destroyed Germany's capacity to sustain modern warfare. It killed and displaced millions of civilians. It created conditions in which the German government could no longer function effectively, and it demonstrated to all involved the terrible power that industrial nations could bring to bear when they committed their full resources to destruction. The story of the strategic bombing campaign against Germany isn't one of precision or surgical strikes or heroic victories. It's a story of industrial slaughter delivered from altitude, of mathematical calculations translated into human suffering, of cities annihilated through the systematic application of overwhelming force. It's uncomfortable to confront this reality, to acknowledge what was done and why it was done, and what it meant for the hundreds of thousands who died and the millions who were affected. But confronting this reality is essential to understanding both what actually happened during World War II and what modern industrial warfare means in practice. The sanitized Hollywood version may be easier to watch, but it tells us nothing about the true nature of what occurred when Allied bombers turned German cities into infernos night after night for years, until nothing remained but ruins and ashes.